Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, February 15, 2022. President Joe Biden warning that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is still possible. Despite the Russian military's claims, it started to pull back some of its forces from the border with Ukraine. President Biden also warning Russia not to target NATO allies, U.S. citizens, or U.S. infrastructure and networks, saying a Russian military conflict with Ukraine could also impact the U.S. economy, especially with higher energy costs. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin saying he is still willing to talk about security concerns of both the Western nations and Russia to defuse the crisis. He met with the German chancellor in Moscow. The U.S. government funding runs out on Friday. A few Republicans holding up a short-term extension unless they get votes on their amendments, including one to end federal vaccine mandates, but both Senate Democratic and Republican leaders sounding optimistic that it will all work out and there'll be no federal government shutdown. We'll talk to a Politico reporter about that. Senate Republicans on the Banking Committee blocking President Biden's Federal Reserve nominees by staying away from a committee meeting, denying the quorum needed to take votes. The full Senate confirms Dr. Robert Califf to lead the Food and Drug Administration. It's the FDA's first appointed and confirmed commissioner in over a year. And the families of the victims of the Sandy Hook Elementary School mass shooting in 2015 settle a lawsuit against the company that made the firearm used in that shooting, settlement for over $73 million. Associated Press out of Moscow reporting that Russian President Vladimir Putin said Tuesday he welcomed a security dialogue with the West as his military reported pulling back some of its troops near Ukraine, signals that may indicate the Kremlin has opted for a diplomatic path for now, despite Western fears of an imminent Russian invasion of its neighbor. AP story goes on, Putin said he doesn't want war and would rely on negotiations as he presses his demand for the West to halt Ukraine's bid to join NATO. At the same time, he didn't commit to a full pullback of troops, saying Russia's next move in the standoff will depend on how the situation evolves. We'll hear from the Russian president in a moment. First, President Joe Biden giving an update from the White House, emphasizing diplomacy is still the preferred route for him.
Yesterday, the Russian government publicly proposed to continue the diplomacy. I agree. We should give the diplomacy every chance to succeed. And I believe there are real ways to address our respective security concerns. The United States has put on the table concrete ideas to establish a security environment in Europe. We're proposing new arms control measures, new transparency measures, new strategic stability measures. These measures would apply to all parties, NATO and Russia alike. And we're willing to make practical, result-oriented steps that can advance our common security. We will not sacrifice basic principles, though. Nations have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. They have the freedom to set their own course and choose with whom they will associate. But that still leaves plenty of room for diplomacy and for de-escalation. That's the best way forward for all parties, in our view. We'll continue our diplomatic efforts in close consultation with our allies and our partners. As long as there is hope of diplomatic resolution that prevents the use of force and avoids incredible human suffering that would follow, we will pursue it. The Russian defense minister reported today that some military units are leaving their positions near Ukraine. That would be good, but we have not yet verified that. We have not yet verified the Russian military units are returning to their home bases. Indeed, our analysts indicate that they remain very much in a threatening position. And the fact remains, right now, Russia has more than 150,000 troops encircling Ukraine and Belarus and along Ukraine's border. An invasion remains distinctly possible. That's why I've asked several times that all Americans in Ukraine leave now before it's too late to leave safely. It is why we have temporarily relocated our embassy from Kyiv to Lviv in western Ukraine, approaching the Polish border. And we've been transparent with the American people and with the world about Russia's plans and the seriousness of the situation so that everyone can see for themselves what is happening. We've shared what we know and what we're doing about it. Let me be equally clear about what we are not doing. The United States and NATO are not a threat to Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia. Neither the U.S. nor NATO have missiles in Ukraine. We do not have plans to put them there as well. We're not targeting the people of Russia. We do not seek to destabilize Russia. To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. And I do not believe you want a bloody, destructive war against Ukraine, a country and a people with whom you share such deep ties of family, history, and culture.
President Biden at the White House, he went on to say that the world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction if it does indeed invade Ukraine. He said invading Ukraine will prove to be a self-inflicted wound. President Biden also warning Russia about expanding a potential conflict to include NATO countries or U.S. citizens or interests. And he also gave a heads up to the American people that a war between Russia and Ukraine could hit the U.S. as well, at least economically.
To be clear, if Russia decides to invade, that would also have consequences here at home. But the American people understand that defending democracy and liberty is never without cost. This is a cause that unites Republicans and Democrats. And I want to thank the leaders and members of Congress of both parties who've forcefully spoken out in defense of our most basic, most bipartisan, most American principles. I will not pretend this will be painless. There could be impact on our energy prices. So we are taking active steps to alleviate the pressure on our own energy markets and offset raising prices. We're coordinating with major energy consumers and producers. We're prepared to deploy all the tools and authority at our disposal to provide relief at the gas pump. And I'll work with Congress on additional measures to help protect consumers and address the impact of prices at the pump. We are not seeking direct confrontation with Russia, though I've been clear that if Russia targets Americans in Ukraine, we will respond forcefully. And if Russia attacks the United States or our allies through asymmetric means, like disruptive cyber attacks against our companies or critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond.
President Biden at the White House. You can find his full statement archived at cspan.org. Russian President Vladimir Putin held talks today in Moscow with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. As the New York Times reports it, Mr. Putin said Russia would keep pushing for its central demands of a rollback of the NATO presence in Eastern Europe and a guarantee that Ukraine never join the alliance. In a joint news conference, President Putin asked whether he could rule out war completely.
About war in Europe, Mr. Chancellor said that his generation, and I'm part of this generation, we can't imagine a war in Europe. This has to do, obviously, about the situation in Ukraine, but we were witness of a Ukrainian Europe which was created by NATO. A major operation with bombs and missiles that bombarding one of the European capitals. This was a fact. We were witness to this type of war and without any sanctions, without any authorization. And this is a very bad example, but this is part of history. And secondly, do we want this? No, of course we don't want this. And this is why we have elaborated our position in terms of security. And that's why we want to negotiate. We want to avoid this. We would like to obtain an agreement on how to guarantee security, our security, all of our security, which also includes Russia. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a constructive answer. We haven't had this. Despite all of this, we think that we can a few answers in the documents that we have received from Washington and NATO. But we are ready to talk about this. If we are also given answers for our three main questions, as I've already said. I've said this in the past, and I've repeated it to the Chancellor. This is the only way that dialogue can continue.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin threw an interpreter at a joint news conference in Moscow with the visiting German chancellor. He referred to NATO bombing a capital. He may have been referring to the Kosovo War in the late 1990s and NATO bombing Belgrade, the capital of the former country of Yugoslavia. From Reuters, Ukraine's defense ministry and 2 banks came under a cyber attack on Tuesday that shut access to the ministry's website, Ukraine's Information Security Center said. The Ukraine Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security, part of the Culture Ministry, did not say who it blamed for the attack, but a statement suggested it was pointing the finger at Russia. That was from Reuters. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is starting a trip in Europe, stops at NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, then to Lithuania and Poland. He'll be meeting leaders and also U.S. troops stationed in Poland. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg previewed tomorrow's defense ministers' meeting and also spoke about the news out of Russia's military that it was pulling back some of its forces from the borders of Ukraine.
Tomorrow, NATO defense ministers will meet to address the most serious security crisis we have faced in Europe for decades. There are signs from Moscow that diplomacy should continue. This gives grounds for cautious optimism. But so far, we have not seen any sign of de-escalation on the ground. Russia has amassed a fighting force in and around Ukraine, unprecedented since the Cold War. Everything is now in place for a new attack. But Russia still has time to step back from the brink, stop preparing for war, and start working for a peaceful solution. NATO allies have been very clear that any further Russian aggression against Ukraine would come at a high price. We have systematically exposed Russia's actions, plans and disinformation to lay bare to the world what Russia is doing and to make it harder for Russia to conduct aggressive actions. At the same time, NATO allies remain ready to engage with Russia. On the 26th of January, I invited Russia to a series of meetings in the NATO-Russia Council. We sent concrete proposals for a substantive agenda to listen to the Russian concerns, share ours, and look for common ground. We are ready to discuss NATO-Russia relations, European security, including the situation in and around Ukraine, and risk reduction, transparency, and arms control. But we will not compromise on our core principles. Every nation has the right to choose its own path. And there will never be first-class and second-class members of NATO. We are all NATO allies.
The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg news conference at NATO headquarters in Brussels. And Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin tweeting today that he has landed in Brussels, Belgium, and will be attending the NATO Defense Ministerial tomorrow. Back in Washington, D.C., this from the Wall Street Journal, a disagreement over how to treat a Russian natural gas pipeline has halted Democratic and Republican efforts to cut a deal on sanctions legislation targeting Russia just days before many U.S. officials say an invasion of Ukraine is possible. Senators from both parties had hoped to agree on legislation that Senator Bob Menendez, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, dubbed the mother of all sanctions. That pipeline is Nord Stream 2. It connects Russia and Germany and bypasses Ukraine. Reporters spoke with senators on the Armed Services Committee about this outside a hearing room today. We start with Kevin Kramer, Republican from North Dakota.
You were supportive of sanctions efforts last week when we talked, but it sort of seems like those have stalled. What's your sense of the situation?
Yeah, it's interesting that unfortunately the sanctions, what I would call very deliberate, very honest, and really accommodating sanctions discussions and debate that have gone on here in the Senate, it seems have been thwarted by the White House, and that's unfortunate. As we know, many of our Democratic colleagues support harsh sanctions on Russia. Many of them supported preemptive sanctions on Nord Stream 2, but didn't want to go up against their president. I understand that, but I do believe that the White House and particularly right in the White House in the Trump administration, or I'm sorry, in the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan especially have, I think, influenced a lot of Democrats to cause some pause there. So that's unfortunate. I think we were very close to a deal last week until there was White House intervention. That said, whatever happens, we have got to come together, both as Western countries in Europe and the United States, and certainly within our two political parties here in the United States, to send a strong message of sanctions should there be an invasion, if we can't do one prior to the invasion.
Would you support a resolution of support for Ukraine? Is that enough?
Well, I would support that, but no, it's not enough. Yeah, of course I would support it. I tend to support anything that's in the increment in the right direction. I tend not to withhold support because something's not, quote, good enough. But that said, we need to do a lot better. Need to be a lot more united. Quite honestly, I think our weakness is part of why we're where we are. I think that as you know, President Biden spent an hour on the phone with President Putin the other day, and the outcome, or at least the readout from the White House itself, was it's no change in posture. Now, since we're seeing a strong, united European front, I think they're having an impact, and rightfully so. So I do worry that our own appeasement, our own expression of weakness coming from Joe Biden and from this administration has been part of what's led us to this point.
Republican Senator Kevin Cramer speaking with reporters on Capitol Hill. He's a member of the Armed Services Committee. The reporters stationed outside the committee room. Also, another member speaking with reporters about all this, Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii.
It seems as though sanctions efforts have sort of stalled here in Congress.
What efforts?
It seems as though efforts to sanction Russia have sort of stalled. Now it seems like maybe we're headed towards a resolution of support for Ukraine. Would you be supportive of that resolution? What other legislative efforts would you like to see?
I didn't think that the sanctions bill was stalled. I think that it was awaiting any further developments because we are very committed to very heavy sanctions against Russia if they continue their aggression, and certainly if they go into Ukraine further. So I think that's always been on the table, and we know that the president can impose sanctions. He has the authority to do so without legislation.
Do you have a timeline for the sanctions?
No, just as I think it's I don't know how to put it, is that there's so much speculation as to what Putin has in mind. And I think that there are concerns that if you impose sanctions too early, then that just might harden his position. And then there are people with the other view that we should impose sanctions now. My view is probably to be cautious about it, but to make it very clear that should we do anything aggressive along the lines of what we have said is not acceptable, that we will bring sanctions down on him. So in a way, it's kind of a this, that, and the other. Stay tuned.
Do you think pre-invasion sanctions are off the table at this point?
I don't know that it's off the table, but I think that it is a serious concern to think that if you impose sanctions, as you put it, that might just harden Putin's position. I think the bottom line really is that Putin is a person who is a megalomaniac, and he just wants the world's attention on him, despite of the fact that he is a multi-billionaire from stealing from his own people.
Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono speaking with reporters outside the Armed Services Committee. She's a member of that committee. Later in the day, a bipartisan message put out by Senate leaders, Republicans and Democrats in the upper leadership, also the heads of key committees. They write, in this dark hour, we're sending a bipartisan message of solidarity and resolve to the people of Ukraine and an equally clear warning to Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. Should Vladimir Putin further escalate his ongoing assault on Ukraine's sovereignty, Russia must be made to pay a severe price. We're prepared to fully support the immediate imposition of strong, robust, and effective sanctions on Russia, as well as tough restrictions and controls on exports to Russia, and we will urge our allies and partners in Europe and around the world to join us. The message also says, make no mistake, the U.S. Senate stands with the people of Ukraine and our NATO allies and partners most threatened by Russian aggression. Our troops stand ready to reinforce the defenses of our Eastern European allies. And this, in the message, the international order established in the aftermath of World War II has not faced such grave threats since the Cold War. Unfortunately, Russia is threatening the system, and the United States is prepared to meet this challenge with bipartisan and unified resolve. You're listening to Washington Today. Now, to keeping the U.S. government open. Current funding runs out on Friday. A handful of Senate Republicans are demanding that a short-term funding extension not pass until they get votes on their amendments. That short-term funding, called a CR or continuing resolution. One group of Senate Republicans wants to deal with federal government vaccine requirements or mandates. And Senator Marsha Blackburn wants to make sure that a safe smoking kit run by an agency in the Health and Human Services Department is not handing out crack pipes. Senator Blackburn spoke with reporters today.
Senator, can we talk to you a little bit about your request for more information from HHS related to the CR?
Sure.
Have you gotten the information that you need from HHS?
No, which is really amazing. I made my request, I think it was Monday a week ago, and just the request is really quite simple. Clarify what you're doing with the money. The federal government should not be using taxpayer money to pay for drug paraphernalia. And we've asked for that clarification. We look forward to receiving that clarification. We're surprised that we have not yet received that clarification.
If you don't receive that clarification by the end of the week, are you prepared to hold up the CR over it?
You need to talk to Leader Schumer on that one.
Thank you, Senator.
Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee. Later, the Senate leaders, Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, and you're going to hear first from Senator Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, Republican from Kentucky, took reporters' questions about the government funding measure.
It's now Tuesday afternoon. Do you think we're going to have government funding? Is there going to be an issue with these amendments or this proposal by Senator Lee on vaccine mandates? Senator Blackburn concerned about these so-called smoking kits and so on. Is this going to be worked out, or are we going to be here Friday night?
Yeah, as is often the case, we'll process a few amendments before doing the short-term CR. I think it'll all be worked out. There's no danger of a government shutdown.
On the CR, I am very optimistic that we will. Leader McConnell, evidently at his briefing a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, said he does not want the government to shut down, and so we will cooperate with him. And I don't believe Republicans want to sponsor a Republican shutdown, plain and simple.
With the latest on the continuing resolution in the Senate, we're joined by Anthony Adragna, congressional reporter at Politico, author of their Congress Minutes. Thank you for being with us. Let's start with Senator Blackburn. What does she want in exchange for letting the CR get through?
Right. Senator Blackburn has basically blocked the speedy consideration of this short-term government spending patch. She says that she'd like more information from the Department of Health and Human Services about this drug harm reduction program. She's expressed concerns, as has several conservative news outlets, that this program would also be handing out crack pipes. That's something that the Biden administration has vehemently denied. The agency itself put out a statement last week denying that that was part of this program. But Senator Blackburn, up until this point, has said that she's not seen sufficient information to satisfy her concerns about this program.
And we have this other group of Republicans looking for a vote on vaccine mandates. Senate has dealt with this before, though.
They have. They voted as part of the last CR. They considered a very similar amendment, but this group of 6 conservative Republicans says that they would like a vote on basically defunding the ability to implement these vaccine mandates, and that's something that they would need before they would allow, again, this short-term spending patch that would essentially buy negotiators 3 more weeks to lock in a broader spending deal. They want this amendment vote before they're willing to consider that short-term patch.
Is the Senate Democratic leadership appear open to having votes on these amendments or some others?
So that's what we're still waiting. You know, Leader Schumer has expressed confidence in their ability to get this done, but we haven't seen any sort of public indication yet of what he's prepared to allow. I think it's notable that Minority Leader Mitch McConnell referenced the fact that they tend to have a couple of quick amendment votes before final passage of these CRs, which have become a Capitol Hill regular feature at this point. And he made that comment again today. He's right about that. We do tend to see these sort of couple votes that are demanded by most of the time conservatives before passage. And it does seem likely that that's going to carry the day again here, although we have not seen, again, any sort of public acknowledgement of that reality.
You mentioned that if the CR passes, it would cover government funding through March 11th. How is the work coming on a full fiscal year omnibus spending package?
Certainly, the negotiators sound the most optimistic that they have in quite a while. It's our understanding that the different subcommittees have now received their new top-line allocations that they'll be negotiating towards. So the work is underway. 3 weeks can both feel like an eternity up here and also not hardly any time at all. They've obviously blown past multiple deadlines on government funding before, but there really is the desire now among Democrats to lock this in. They think a worst-case scenario would be locking in a full-year continuing resolution, which would, again, preserve programs at their levels from the Trump administration. So there really is the desire to get this done, and we'll see if they're able to do it.
We're talking with Anthony Adragna from Politico. And on your Congress Minute, they can find it on Twitter at PoliticCongress, you write about what Senate Democrats have been talking about today: inflation gripping U.S. economy. They're batting around ideas to suspend some taxes to lower prices. How far have they gotten with that?
It's certainly been interesting to see them talking about this publicly. It was definitely the public message that they were trying to drive home after their conference discussion today. And I think what they're realizing is that this is something that is front of mind for a lot of people, things like higher gas prices, higher costs of groceries. And so they're really pushing and, again, talking through a bunch of ideas that they think would help. One idea that's been pushed, legislation that was introduced by their four most vulnerable incumbents last week, all up for re-election in the Senate, is this idea of suspending the federal gas tax for the remainder of the year in an attempt to, again, address the pressures that people are feeling at the pump. Leader Schumer left the discussions and said there was not yet a conference-wide position on that idea. I think a lot of people would see this as kind of a political gesture during the election year, but that is one idea that they are currently discussing, and we'll see if it gets further traction up here.
Anthony Adragna covers Congress for Politico. Follow him on Twitter at Anthony Adragna and his stories at Politico.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wall Street today, the Dow up 422, NASDAQ up 348, S&P up 69. Senate Republicans on the Senate Banking Committee boycotting votes on the White House's nominees for the Federal Reserve. Washington Post explaining the GOP opposition has coalesced on Sarah Bloom Raskin, a former Federal Reserve governor who has pledged to focus on the ways climate change threatens financial stability and the overall economy. More recently, Republicans have zeroed in on her time on the board of a Colorado payments firm, which got access to a Federal Reserve payments system during Raskin's tenure on the firm's board. The Senate Banking Committee ranking Republican Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania spoke to reporters ahead of today's meeting.
The fact that Sarah Raskin has repeatedly, publicly, and forcefully advocated for the Fed to use its supervisory powers as a way to allocate capital away from carbon-intensive industries, that's more than sufficient reason to oppose her nomination, in my view. But that is not the reason that Republicans are unlikely to provide a quorum this afternoon. The reason we're not providing a quorum is because we can't get straight answers to simple questions. Just as a reminder, Reserve Trust is a fintech company based in Colorado. They applied for a very, very valuable master account at the Fed, and they were turned down. Sarah Raskin went on their board, called the Fed, and months later, the Fed did a 180-degree reversal and granted them what I believe is the only fintech master account in America. We've simply asked questions about how and why did the Fed make a 180-degree reversal? What role did Sarah Raskin play in that? And we are getting stonewalled. It is not acceptable to provide no answers for the committee that is evaluating her fitness to go back on the Fed. And that's the reason that it's unlikely that they'll have a quorum.
Senator Pat Toomey is ranking Republican on the Banking Committee. Sarah Bloom Raskin nominated for Federal Reserve Vice Chair for Supervision. And later in the day, Republicans on the Banking Committee did not show up to the markup, denying a quorum, all 12 of them staying away. And the committee chair, Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio, said he had to postpone votes.
But instead of showing up to work to do their jobs, Republicans have walked out on the American people. My Republican colleagues claim it's because they haven't gotten the information they've requested from one of the nominees. Let me be clear, Ms. Bloom Raskin has been the subject of an unrelenting smear campaign in fear-mongering by the ranking member and Republicans, something that's become all too common. They've distorted her words. They've painted her as some sort of radical. As we've heard during her nomination hearing, in her own words, Ms. Bloom Raskin is a mainstream economic thinker, been confirmed twice by unanimous votes in this Senate. She's not in the business of telling banks whom to lend to. Her views on climate are not extreme. They're about accounting for risks that threaten our financial system wherever we may find them. As she said over and over again, this is about economic and financial system resilience. The attacks on Ms. Bloom Raskin haven't stopped there. They become more personal. They can't attack her on substance. She's so qualified. So they've engaged in malicious character assassination and innuendo without offering real evidence. Through this entire process from day one, she's been transparent. She's gone to great lengths to respond quickly to the committee.
That's Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, the Banking Committee chair, at today's meeting in which he did postpone the votes. The opposition, as you heard from the ranking Republican on the committee, was against the nominee Sarah Bloom Raskin, but all votes on all the nominees were delayed, 5 of them, including renomination of Fed Chair Jerome Powell for another term. Washington Today continues in a minute.
Live Wednesday on C-SPAN Radio at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, a House Oversight Subcommittee hearing on protecting U.S. allies in Eastern Europe from Russian aggression. Witnesses include former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, and former Acting Director of National Intelligence, Richard Grenell. And live Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, the House Administration Committee holds a hearing titled Big Data, Privacy Risks, and Needed Reforms in the Public and Private Sectors. Listen to C-SPAN Radio anywhere on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. The Food and Drug Administration has an appointed and confirmed commissioner for the first time in about 400 days. Dr. Robert Califf, cardiologist and Duke University researcher, confirmed by the Senate today by a vote of 50 to 46. Senator Mike Rounds, Republican of South Dakota, voted present, and one senator did not vote, Ben Lujan, Democrat of New Mexico. He is away from Washington recovering from a stroke. The vote was mostly party line. 5 Democrats voted no. 6 Republicans voted yes. Here's some of the Senate floor debate. We start with an opponent, Ed Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts.
At this point, the opioid epidemic has evolved from being driven by prescription drugs to being fueled by the illicit synthetic opioids like fentanyl. But that does not dismiss the FDA from accountability or the need for reform. When I met with Dr. Califf last year, I asked him to commit, if confirmed as FDA commissioner, to finally change FDA's processes to ensure it does not make the opioid overdose epidemic worse than it already has. During our meeting, Dr. Califf did not commit to the decisive and comprehensive action which we need. After years of agency failures and in the midst of a worsening opioid epidemic, we need FDA leadership that is fully committed to using all of the agency's oversight authority to protect public health. I cannot support Dr. Califf's nomination in light of that critical mandate which we need.
Democratic Senator Ed Markey on the Senate floor. Another senator opposed to Dr. Califf becoming FDA commissioner, but for a different reason. Steve Daines, Republican from Montana.
I rise in opposition to the Biden administration's nomination of Robert Califf to be the FDA commissioner. As FDA commissioner during the Obama administration, Mr. Califf showed blatant disregard for the unborn and for the health and safety of women and girls when he weakened safety and reporting requirements for a dangerous chemical abortion drug. In fact, this past December, the Biden administration went further and announced it would eliminate entirely the in-person dispensing requirement for the abortion drug. This very reckless decision promotes mail-order, do-it-yourself abortion on demand, and disregards the growing threat to women's health posed by chemical abortion drugs. For example, without physician in-person screening, women are denied the opportunity to be screened for dangerous conditions like ectopic pregnancies, which can cause life-threatening complications. Mr. Califf has refused to distance himself from the FDA's decision to abandon vulnerable pregnant women to the reckless and predatory actions of the abortion industry. Mr. Califf has a track record of putting an extreme abortion agenda above the science.
Republican Senator Steve Daines on the Senate floor. And this nomination did go through, and both the Democratic chair of the Senate Health Committee and its ranking Republican supported it. Here's the chair, Patty Murray, from Washington State.
I urge all of my colleagues to give families across the country the peace of mind and give the hardworking staff at the FDA the experienced Senate-confirmed leadership it needs by joining me in confirming Dr. Califf today and working with him and FDA to continue protecting families across our country, upholding the gold standard of safety and effectiveness, and putting science and data first. We previously confirmed Dr. Califf for this role in a bipartisan way, and we recently advanced his nomination out of the Help Committee with bipartisan support. So I hope today, once again, this qualified nomination passes with the bipartisan support it deserves.
That's Democratic Senator Patty Murray, chair of the Health Committee. She referred to the last time Dr. Califf was FDA commissioner under President Obama. He was confirmed 89-4, and that time 21 Republicans who voted yes in 2016, they voted no today. But the ranking Republican on the Health Committee, as mentioned, Richard Burr of North Carolina, supported the nomination today.
There's been a lot of criticism as to what he's done. I've never seen an FDA commissioner in 9 months of service, and that was the length of his time at the FDA, that accomplished anything, much less as many negatives that have been raised. But as the ranking member of the Help Committee and as a fellow North Carolinian, I'd like to share with my colleagues that Dr. Califf is a supremely qualified nominee with bipartisan support. He has the robust agency and private sector experience needed to help build on the success of the FDA in helping Americans get back to normal life with the approval of tests, vaccines, and therapeutics that are bringing the pandemic to an end. He's the leader we need today, but also for the future.
That's Senator Richard Burr, the ranking Republican on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee during today's floor debate before the confirmation vote. Dr. Califf going through 50-46. From CNN, a push for swift passage of a sweeping bill with bipartisan support to overhaul the U.S. Postal Service's finances hit a snag Monday evening in the Senate. Senator Rick Scott of Florida objected to a unanimous consent request from the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to make a technical fix to the bill. Scott argued there are issues with the legislation and that the Senate should slow down and work to improve it. As a result, the Senate was not able to proceed to a planned vote to advance the bill Monday night. Schumer said that being unable to immediately make the technical fix will delay the bill, but vowed the Senate will eventually pass it. That was from CNN. Here's Senator Rick Scott on the Senate floor Monday night after the unanimous consent request from the Majority Leader and right before he objected.
Let me first say that I care deeply about fixing the problems with the United States Postal Service. The Postal Service provides an essential service and touches the lives of nearly every American. The Postal Service also consumes billions in taxpayer and consumer money every year. meaning that it has to be accountable to taxpayers and consumers, not only in how effectively it delivers, but in how it spends the dollars it receives. So I absolutely support getting something done to reform the Postal Service, ensure it is more accountable to taxpayers and consumers. I also support provisions of this bill, like its focus on enhanced services for rural communities, which will benefit many families across my great state. I like the fact that it maintains the current 6-day mail delivery schedule. Unfortunately, there are also pieces of this bill that set us back and block the opportunity for us to achieve our shared goal of responsibly reforming the Postal Service. What I'm asking for here is not unreasonable. I simply want the Senate to have the opportunity to work on this, improve it, and deliver a bill that truly works. The Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs has jurisdiction over the Postal Service. I am absolutely very proud to serve on this committee. Unfortunately, the committee has not held one hearing or member meeting on the bill, nor has the bill even been considered at a markup. Madam President, we aren't here just considering a simple resolution. This is a massive, multi-billion-dollar bill that has huge impacts on Medicare recipients, and the Democrat majority skipped the committee process and rushed the bill to the floor. Despite the rush process around the bill, a few details need to be highlighted, and they are not pretty. First, I said before, this bill does not fix the underlying issues with the Postal Service, nor does it make it profitable. I don't understand why the Postal Service loses money and cannot be profitable. I don't think many Americans understand why. Madam President, America is more than $30 trillion in debt. We can't afford to add more stress on our already enormous national debt with poor financial planning, which I think this bill absolutely does. In fact, this bill simply shifts risk to Medicare recipients by adding billions in new costs to Medicare.
Senator Rick Scott, Republican from Florida, on the Senate floor Monday night. Sponsors of this bill say it would save the Postal Service $50 billion over 10 years, eliminating a requirement that the Postal Service prepay future retirement health benefits, switching them to Medicare, and allowing the Postal Service to provide non-postal services if they contract with local governments on that, and also guaranteeing mail delivery 6 days a week. Senator Scott then objected to the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's unanimous consent request for a technical fix, setting the timeline to consider the bill and pass it back this morning. Senator Schumer addressed that on the floor.
Last night, and this is relevant to what we just did, putting the new bill on the calendar for a second reading, last night we had a chance to continue progress on a bipartisan, long overdue postal reform bill when I moved to expeditiously fix a few technical errors to the legislation sent to us by the House. Sadly, my request was blocked by the junior senator from Florida, without much in the way of clear explanation. For instance, he says he wants to stand up for postal workers, but all the organizations representing postal workers strongly support this bill. They are eager for it. He says he wants to strengthen Medicare, but Postal already pays into Medicare, and the CBO says that this proposal, this bill, will save the government money. So I hope, for the sake of our postal workers, our postal service, and for the millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of Americans who depend on postal service, that this is not obstruction for obstruction's sake. This is a textbook example, Mr. President, of why Americans often get frustrated with the Senate and with Washington. Postal reform is highly bipartisan. It got a majority of votes in the House from both parties. It's desperately needed. We all hear from our constituents about snail mail and the price they pay for it. It's backed by both parties in both houses, including the chairman and ranking member of the relevant committees, the Democratic and Republican leading members of both committees. And it has broad support from the postal workers, who tend to be Democratic, and Postmaster DeJoy, who is a friend of President Trump's and was appointed by him. Nevertheless, it was blocked. I am sure that Republicans don't want to be the party that was responsible for blocking popular and bipartisan postal reform. The delay is regrettable, but the good news is that we will get bipartisan postal reform done. It's been negotiated for months and debated for a decade. It has enough bipartisan support, more than enough, ample support, to become law. And I'm hopeful we'll move it through this chamber as quickly as we can. And that's what the procedural motion I did before was about.
Senator Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor this morning. Senate is not planning to be in session next week, and with everything else on the agenda to get passed this week, some nominations, the short-term government funding bill, it is expected the Postal Service bill will be pushed off until the Senate returns the week of February 28th. The families of 9 victims of the 2015 Sandy Hook Elementary School mass shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, killed 20 first graders and 6 educators, have agreed to a $73 million settlement of a lawsuit against Remington, which manufactured the Bushmaster AR-15 style rifle used by the killer. Settlement also allows release of documents obtained during the lawsuit showing how Remington marketed the weapon. At a news conference today, the mother of one of the victims, Noah Posner, Veronique De La Rosa.
I thought December 14th, 2012 would be just an ordinary day in a string of ordinary days. But my little boy, Noah, never came home from school that day. I invite you all to imagine, one moment we had this dazzling, energetic 6-year-old little boy, and the next, all we had left were echoes of the past, photographs of a lost child who will never grow older, calendars marking a horrifying new anniversary, and a lonely grave and pieces of Noah's life now stored in boxes and in his school backpack. Every day is a realization that he should be here, yet he's not. Those of you who have never lost a child don't want to imagine, and those who have know what I mean. What is lost remains lost forever. Today marks an inflection point when our duty of care to our children as a society finally supersedes the bottom line of an industry that made such an atrocity as Sandy Hook possible to begin with. Today is a day of accountability for an industry that has thus far enjoyed operating with immunity and impunity. And for this, I am grateful. Thank you.
Veronique De La Rosa, mother of Noah Posner, one of the first graders killed in 2015 at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Some background from Associated Press. The civil court case that was filed focused on how the firearm used by the shooter was marketed, alleging it targeted younger at-risk males in marketing and product placement in violent video games. Remington had argued there was no evidence to establish its marketing had anything to do with the shooting. Company had also said the lawsuit should have been dismissed because of a federal law that gives broad immunity to the gun industry. But the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled Remington could be sued under state law over how it marketed the rifle. Gunmaker appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. Insurance companies for Remington agreed to pay the $73 million settlement because Remington was founded in 1816, filed for bankruptcy in 2020. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. You get more top Washington stories sent to your inbox every day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we take your calls live on the air on the news of the day and discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Wednesday morning, we'll talk about challenges to democracies worldwide and what it means for U.S. foreign policy with Elizabeth Shackelford, Senior Fellow with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And author Garrett Graff discusses his new book, Watergate, A New History. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern, Wednesday morning on C-SPAN or C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app. Join the conversation with your phone calls, Facebook comments, text messages, and tweets.